Everyone. I'm happy to be here in this conference again for the third time. For those who've attended the previous two, you know what excitement it is. I'm looking at the attendance and I can see very many familiar faces, and it's only telling me now we want to go beyond and do things differently. But let me control the excitement and honor the privilege of introducing Professor David Mickler, who is our first keynote speaker for the day. And so I'll go ahead and read his bio. Prof. David Mickler is a Dean Global, Africa and Founding Director, Center for Australia-Africa Relations in the Office of the Deputy Vice Chancellor Global and an Associate Professor of International Relations in the Faculty of Humanities at Curtin University, Perth. He is the co-chair of the flagship Australia-Africa Universities Network, AAUN, and he co-convenes the AAUN Emerging Leaders in Australia-Africa Diplomacy, which is ELAAD program. He has convened the Australia-Africa Literacy Program for the Australian Department at Foreign Affairs and Trade Diplomatic Academy in Canberra. Prof. Mickler is a future Africa visiting scholar at the University of Pretoria, South Africa, a research affiliate in the Department of Diplomacy and International Studies at the University of Nairobi, Kenya, and a senior fellow of the Higher Education Academy. He also serves as the Australian representative to the Indian Ocean Rim Association Academic Group and convenes the annual IORA Collaborative Regional Short Course International Relations in the Indian Ocean region. He's the founder and deputy co-chair of the IORA Indian Ocean University Network. He's also a member of the advisory board for the Organization of African Communities in Western Australia, the African Communities of Critical Security Scholars, and the Women in Security, Peace and Diplomacy Network in West Africa. Prof. Mickler was previously founding director of the African Research and Engagement Center at the University of Western Australia, chair of the faculty African Regional Strategy Group at the University of Melbourne, and inaugural co-chair of the Global Africa Group in the Worldwide University Network. He has also been a visiting scholar at Addis Ababa University, Ethiopia, and at the African Union Commission, Ethiopia and South Africa, and has developed academic partnerships in several African countries, including the African Green Hydrogen Hub in Kenya. His books include New Engagement, Contemporary Australian Foreign Policy Towards Africa, that was published in 2013, The African Union Addressing the Challenges of Peace, Security and Governance, published in 2016, and Africa and Sustainable Development Goals, published in 2020. He is a chief investigator on the African Research Council Discovery Project, African Impact in Australia, and co-editor in the book project Australia-Africa Science Diplomacy, Collaborative Research Policy, Impact and International Cooperation, which is under development. Prof. Mickler works closely on Africa and Indian Ocean research, teaching, training, and external engagement with a range of stakeholders in academia, government, industry, and diaspora communities. In 2018, he won the Community Pillar Excellence in Innovation Award at the Western Australian African Community Awards. In 2023, he won the Global Award for Leadership at Curtin University. In 2024, he won both the Friend of Zimbabwe Award at the National Australian Zimbabwe Achievers Award and the Global Impact Award at the Curtin University Global Recognition Awards. And this year, he won an individual award, Outstanding Contribution to the Advancement of African Australians at the inaugural African Australian Multicultural Celebration, hosted by the African Australian Advocacy Centre in Sydney. Please, let's all warmly welcome Prof. David. Karibu sana, Prof. David. You can always drop a chat in your language to just welcome him. Prof, take it on. Thank you.
Asante sana, Dr. Vera. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And thank you very much for the kind invitation to speak here at the African Science Frontiers Initiatives Conference for 2025. It's very exciting to be here. I'm deeply grateful to the ASFI founder and executive director, Professor Bright Nwaru, and the whole ASFI team for this wonderful opportunity to engage with you. And a big congratulations on convening this important and very impactful conference, the third conference, and with really great attendance. So it's a big congratulations to you. I hope you can understand my Australian accent. Sometimes we have to translate Australian into English. So if you have any trouble with my accent, let me know. Um, I'm based here at Curtin University in Perth, which is in Western Australia on the Indian Ocean coast, which actually is the part of Australia that faces towards the African continent. So we feel connected across the Indian Ocean to Africa here. Now, it's a tradition in Australia that we formally acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which we live and work. And this is part of Australia's ongoing process of reconciliation with the Indigenous peoples of this land, whose history goes back 65,000 years as the oldest continuing culture living in the world. Of course, impacted by the British colonisation of the country in the late 18th century. So I therefore acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional owners and custodians of the land on which I live and work here in Perth, and I pay my respect to elders past and present. I would also like to acknowledge that this is and always will be Aboriginal land, and that their sovereignty was never ceded as part of the colonial process. I also acknowledge the value of Indigenous knowledge systems, including the ways in which they inform our understandings of and relationships to each other, to country, and to the world around us. So it's an important tradition that we always do at the start of a presentation in Australia. Now, I'm not African. I was born in Australia. I've lived and worked in Australia for most of my career, although I have been visiting Africa regularly for the last 15 or so years as part of my academic work. So my connection to the African continent really comes from my PhD supervisor back in the mid-2000s, Professor Samuel Makinda, who was a Kenyan academic based in Australia. And at the time, he was, I think, the only African professor in my field in Australia. So I was very excited and privileged to have the opportunity to work with him and to be mentored by him. And indeed, we still collaborate to this day. So through supervising my fourth year honours and then PhD projects, Professor Makinda turned my wider interest in international politics into a particular focus on Africa's international relations, including by examining African ways of thinking and practicing politics and governance and diplomacy. So for me, after graduating my PhD that had an Africa focus, I realized that there were very few Africa focused centres or programs in Australia for me to contribute to. So I've spent the subsequent time working with a relatively small group of colleagues here in Australia to build platforms at Australian universities that help to connect our two continents through building knowledge of each other, what we call Australia-Africa literacy, but also building science diplomacy between our two continents. And I'll talk a bit more about that, of course, today. So I provide this personal background and story for several reasons. Firstly, it demonstrates the important contributions made by members of the African diaspora, including the science diaspora, to human capacity building, knowledge production, and broader international cooperation in Australia. My supervisor now proudly cites the work that I have subsequently done as one of his own principal contributions to Australia's knowledge economy as a Kenyan migrant academic. So I'm therefore the direct product of African diasporic academic excellence. This is truly this notion of beyond boundaries, making an impactful contribution as an African diaspora academic, producing someone from Australia who then engages through the academic sector with Africa. Secondly, it also demonstrates the importance of context. So I work from within a specific context of Australia-Africa relations, which is one in which both Australia and the African continent really sit at each other's margins in terms of knowledge and engagement. There's subsequently very little wider government policy or strategy or available funding or even mainstream visibility for this work that myself and others are doing. It does sit at the margins. And it's useful to consider this context within the wider framing of global North, global South relations, including in relation to the higher education and research sector, in which Australia does not neatly fit within that binary, perhaps in relation to other countries in Europe and North America. So I do work from a particular context, and I think we all work from particular contexts, and that's important to remember. And thirdly, the background demonstrates both the opportunities and challenges of using science diplomacy to build education partnerships across continents to benefit both society and science over the long term. And in the case of Australia-Africa collaboration, this is really a very long-term project starting from quite a low base of resources and interest from both sides. So I've just provided that context to help situate myself in this discussion. So in this address, I'd like to discuss the concept and practice of science diplomacy, drawing on examples from my work and the work of others over the last 15 or so years in building Australia-Africa collaborations through the higher education and research sector. Science diplomacy and its related terms and concepts such as knowledge diplomacy, education diplomacy, or academic diplomacy is a useful concept for thinking about the various dimensions of the relationships between individual academics or scientists or researchers or scholars, the institutions they work for, such as universities or research institutes, and wider diplomatic relationships between the countries in which those people and institutions are based. Now, when we think about traditional diplomacy, we normally associate this with the official business of governments, of states. And the Oxford English Dictionary defines diplomacy as, quote, the management of international relations by negotiation, the methods by which these relations are adjusted and managed by ambassadors and envoys, the business or art of the diplomatist, end quote. Kerr and Wiseman in 2023 contended that the function of diplomacy is that, quote, diplomats in ministries of foreign affairs and missions abroad represent, report, and communicate their state's interests, end quote. And Pigman agrees that, quote, representation and communication are the two core functions of diplomatic actors and activities. As such, traditional diplomacy is seen as the business of governments, and there are many, many types of diplomacy that governments are engaged in, bilateral diplomacy, multilateral, crisis diplomacy, summit diplomacy, digital diplomacy, public diplomacy, and so on. But what we're interested in here is the diplomatic roles played by non-state actors, including in what's called track 1.5 or track 2 diplomacy, where academics are often invited into meetings by governments, but also beyond these existing channels for dialogue. And here I really like Bertrand Badie's 2013 concept of what he calls an evolving intersocial diplomacy in a globalized world. This idea of intersocial diplomacy rather than international diplomacy. And this intersocial diplomacy opens the door to a more independent role for actors in the academic world engaging in practices of science diplomacy. So Badie writes, quote, the emerging global order incorporates new sets of relationships, or what might be called intersocial relations, between peoples, groups, and sovereign states. In these complex new relationships, social issues are becoming dominant, and international social integration among the various international actors is becoming an accepted norm of international diplomatic activity. Under these changing circumstances, social actors such as private individuals and non-governmental organizations are acquiring new instruments and resources for participating autonomously in diplomatic activities. So science diplomacy then, as a form of intersocial diplomacy, refers to various connections between, on the one hand, science and knowledge, and on the other hand, policy making and diplomacy in the contexts of international cooperation. And here we take, I take an inclusive definition of science to include natural science, human science, social science, and the other branches of science, an inclusive definition. Now, in 2010, the Royal Society produced a foundational report called New Frontiers in Science Diplomacy, where it usefully outlined three main dimensions of this concept. The first dimension is science in diplomacy, and what that means is informing foreign policy objectives and decisions with scientific advice. So making sure that government policy, particularly in relation to international policy, is informed by good science. And you could think here of fields like climate change, like health and pandemics, like in relation to new technologies. The desire to have government policies informed by good science rather than by political considerations. The second dimension is what's called diplomacy for science. And this refers to using traditional diplomatic mechanisms to facilitate international science cooperation. So this might include things like governments sponsoring major international scientific conferences or funding major collaborative scientific studies that would bring benefits across borders. So using diplomacy to advance scientific collaboration internationally. The third formulation is science for diplomacy. And this refers to using science cooperation that's already taking place to improve international relations between countries. So in other words, when you have good collaboration between, say, universities across borders, this might be a reason for governments to start collaborating in a more productive way, building on the science collaboration. Now, building on this, we can also examine the institutional role of universities as the principal academic institutions in our societies in undertaking forms of international diplomacy themselves. And I can see at least two roles for universities here in this respect. The first is universities building and managing international collaborations among themselves or among academic institutions. So this is where, for those of us who have worked in, for example, the international office of a university, you are actually involved in negotiating partnerships between universities, signing collaboration MOUs, signing research partnership agreements. It might be a student exchange agreement or an agreement to have a joint PhD program, or it might be about joining an international university network. These are all essentially diplomatic functions that universities perform in building science collaboration with one another. The second role for universities is to be a tool for building wider collaboration between countries. And this is where some governments use their own universities as a tool of what's called soft power in their international diplomacy. They actually position universities as strategic tools of government when they want to build a partnership with another country. They can start with or include university-to-university collaboration as a tool of soft power to that end. Now consider, for example, the structure of a university's international or global office and map that structure onto the roles and functions of a foreign ministry. And you'll find that there's a number of similarities across the institutional structures. For example, a deputy vice chancellor global or a vice president international might actually perform similar functions to the foreign minister of a government for their own institution. And the increasing establishment of universities having overseas branch campuses in other regions and countries also provides those universities with a form of embassy operating overseas. with the head of that campus serving a similar role to an ambassador. And these overseas campuses actually build deeper direct knowledge about those regions in which the campuses sit. They provide a channel for direct communication on what's happening in that region. And they also provide greater visibility for the university and serve to represent the university's interests internationally. So we can start to see here how universities can actually perform some of these functions that we traditionally associate with governments and with traditional diplomacy. Now, I want to share some thoughts on this idea of universities providing a kind of science diplomacy or academic diplomacy. Firstly, I think we need to understand context, as I said at the start of the presentation. These issues are thought about and practiced differently in different regions and countries and contexts. The status of a university in a particular country can take on a very different form to that of another country. In some countries, universities are still held up as the central institution of national development. But in other countries, we see universities being attacked as being a waste of money and the source of all problems of society. So there's quite a lot of difference in the way universities are positioned in their own countries. Of course, the level of independence of universities in different countries is also variable. Some universities are very closely tied to government. And in fact, senior leaders of universities are appointed directly by governments, whereas in other cases, they're more independent from government. So when we think of science diplomacy, we need to understand the relationship between universities and their own governments in relation to that diplomacy. Universities also have significant convening power or the ability to bring diverse stakeholders together. Because universities have usually the right facilities, technologies, and legitimacy to perform the role of being the place that people convene, this can be used strategically as a tool of academic diplomacy. And finally, we need to think about how different universities have different approaches to international collaboration. Some universities are very focused on local development needs and are not particularly focused on international collaboration. Other universities have very elaborate structures for pursuing science diplomacy, but others don't and don't have the resources to do that. So we need to understand the variability across different types of institutions. Secondly, academic diplomacy is normally considered to be a relatively positive activity. It usually involves some level of win-win relationships. It usually doesn't have the same level of coercion that traditional government diplomacy has. And as I said earlier, it can be seen as a form of soft power, an attractive form of partnership that might lead to the building of friendly relations in other areas beyond the higher education sector. Thirdly, academic diplomacy has limitations, and we need to be realistic about its impact. Firstly, most universities don't have the same level of resources as countries, although some universities do have very significant multi-billion-dollar endowments. But many universities across the world don't have that kind of resourcing to be able to put towards building academic diplomacy practices. Universities are also subjected to rapid changes in government policies and changes in global conditions, which affect how they can operate. They're not necessarily powerful enough to be able to operate independently of some geopolitical trends, or, for example, if a country-to-country relationship breaks down at the diplomatic level, that might actually mean the cutting off of certain academic collaboration, whether it's research or student exchanges and so on. So we need to be careful to think about the relationship between universities and the wider geopolitical and political environment. Universities also have often trust challenges with government. There's a healthy skepticism, I think, between universities and governments. There's opportunities, of course, to collaborate, and in many cases, there's a reliance on resources coming from government to universities, but there's not always a level of trust, given that, for example, some science challenges government policy and is critical of government policy. So we need to be aware of that. And we also need to be conscious of the historical and contemporary inequalities, not just globally in the broader geopolitical environment, but also within the higher education and research sector. So even though there's potential for win-win scenarios in academic diplomacy, there's also structural power imbalances and resourcing imbalances that need to be very clearly put on the table as part of any diplomatic negotiation by universities. And finally, there's the question of how do we measure the impact or success of academic diplomacy? What are the objectives that we would be trying to achieve through pursuing this form of international collaboration? Is it about building research partnerships? Is it measured by the level of research impact or grants, collaborative grants achieved? Is it about the level of student recruitment, the level of exchange programs, joint teaching and research programs? Perhaps it's measured by the impact of collaborations on local communities. Or is it measured through the impact that university to university collaboration can have on wider international diplomatic outcomes? So thinking through exactly what we're trying to achieve and how we would measure success is an important part of thinking about the value of science diplomacy. So I want to turn now to share some examples of Australia-Africa platforms that we've created to build understanding and collaboration between our two continents. So as mentioned above, I work from a very specific context in which Africa sits at the margins of Australia's national knowledge and engagement. And likewise, Australia is quite marginal to thinking in many African countries, from my experience, when it comes to where Australia sits in the wider international system. And maybe there's a few countries like South Africa, Kenya, Mauritius, where Australia has a bit more visibility, but overall, I think we would be quite low on the list of awareness and priorities for many African countries. And so for this reason, I've been quite interested in thinking about the role of academic diplomacy as a way to build broader interest from the Australian society and Australian government in partnerships with Africa. So in this particular context, academic diplomacy takes on quite an important role, but again, that might be different in different contexts to the one I work in. So Australia has its origins as a British colony, but for the past 50 or so years, the country has sought to integrate with Asia as a modern multicultural society. And this engagement in Asia has been largely successful for Australia, certainly economically very, very successful. But this concentration of attention on Asia for Australia has really meant that other regions of the world have been marginalized, and Africa is one of those. So we don't currently have an Australian national strategy for how to engage with Africa. And this makes it difficult for universities to plug into a wider strategy. So for the higher education and research sector, what this means in terms of how it's reflected is that we have a historically limited number of institutional partnerships between Australia and Africa. We have a limited number of joint research projects, limited collaborative research grant opportunities, limited funded staff and student exchange opportunities. We have a relatively limited number of African students studying in Australia and even less Australian students studying in Africa. We have no African studies degree anywhere in Australia and also no Australian studies degree anywhere in Africa. And we currently have only 2 Africa-focused centres at Australian universities. So that just gives you a bit of a snapshot at how marginal this relationship is both at the wider political level, but also within the higher education and research sector. Now, myself and two African colleagues, research colleagues, are currently exploring questions around understanding Australia-Africa relations through decolonial lenses. And in one of our first papers, we found a, quote, lack of a neat fit within a historicized articulation of colonizer-colonized relationship that we see between Europe and Africa. And we show that despite this lack of fit, Australia's relations with the countries of Africa reinforce long-standing patterns of knowledge, power, and being associated with colonialism. So in this context, we've also sought to examine Australia-Africa higher education collaborations in terms of whether this relative marginality and the relative newness of the relationships actually opens up space to have more innovative practice in higher education collaboration and not fall into the repeating the long-standing structures and engagements and exploitation that we've seen between global North and global South universities in other contexts and historically. So that's the context that we are working in, both at the margins, but in this interesting space where we're thinking through what does Australia-Africa collaboration actually mean in the wider context of global North-South relations. So we've taken up the challenge of thinking critically about this, but also in doing so, trying to build platforms in a practical sense for Australia-Africa collaboration through the higher education sector. So using academic diplomacy to do this. So I just want to highlight some of these platforms to give you some examples of the work that we're doing. Now, the first of these is the Australia-Africa Universities Network, AAUN. This was a network established back in 2013, and it's premised on an idea of equal governance and equal resourcing. So we have a co-chair arrangement, one co-chair from Australia, one from Africa. We have separate steering committees who meet jointly and separately for both continents. We have a funding model that is based on our institutional membership fees. So universities pay an annual fee to join. That money is then pooled collectively to be used for the activities of the network. We also receive some funding from the South African National Research Foundation on top of the membership fee. We have now 26 university members, 11 from Australia and 15 from Africa. We hold annual high-level forums, 2 each year, one in Australia, one in Africa, rotating around. Most recently, we had forums in Rwanda on AI and higher education, and here in Australia on the just energy transition. And in these forums, we bring together senior academic leaders, senior and junior and early career researchers, students, diplomats, policymakers, and other community representatives. We also have an annual memorial lecture, which we use to focus attention on Australia-Africa cooperation. We run an annual research seed funding scheme for members of the network. And the rules, again, are that at least 2 Australian and 2 African universities have to be part of the application. The application themes are pre-agreed on areas of mutual expertise, such as climate change, agriculture, public health, AI, and a few others. And then when we allocate the grants, we make sure that an equal number are led by African CIs and Australian CIs. So again, this equal partnership model is quite central to the way that we operate. We also launched in the last 18 months an early career researchers group, specifically within the network, to support the development of the next generation of researchers on both sides of the ocean. And we've attached an annual research prize to the ECR group. So there'll be one prize for an Australian-based winner and one prize for an African-based winner. As part of the network, we also launched the Emerging Leaders in Australia-Africa Diplomacy Initiative. And this program is a virtual program for master's level students from the 26 members of the network, as well as junior diplomats from Australia and African countries involved. So we bring together this cohort who are either aspiring diplomats or scholars or current serving diplomats to look at how we can collaborate across various themes and providing professional development training. The network's also been involved in developing collaborative research projects. So we currently have a book project on Australia-Africa science diplomacy, which has a very deliberate co-authorship model where each chapter is co-authored by 3 people, again, with a mix of African-based lead authors and Australian-based lead authors. And the book also involves policymakers and diplomats. So again, we're trying to use this notion of science diplomacy or academic diplomacy to connect scholars and policymakers and diplomats in this endeavor. Now, we've also launched since then another network, the Indian Ocean University Network, launched about a year ago in Mauritius. This one now has 12 foundational member universities from across Africa, Asia, and Australia. Again, it has a co-chair model, in this case between Australia and Mauritius. But this one is a bit different, this network, because we've linked this network directly to the Indian Ocean Rim Association, which is the intergovernmental body for the region. And this is an experiment in more direct science diplomacy, where we're attaching a university collaboration network to an international organization. And it's a bit of an experiment in how that works. Again, we have a membership fee-based model, so we scale that based on national development indicators. So richer countries pay more and so on, but the money is then pooled and used to redistribute to the activities of the network. We'll have a high-level forum where, again, we bring together both scholars and policymakers, and this will be held next year in Kenya. We have a short course program for master's level students, which looks at the international relations of the Indian Ocean region. So again, we're building academic collaboration in the next generation of scholars and policymakers. And we'll also have a seed funding research grant internally to the network, which will focus on priority themes that are already agreed by the countries of the region. And in this case, it focuses on issues like maritime safety, the blue economy, women's economic empowerment, illegal fishing, impact of climate on the oceans, and so on. A third network that we've been involved in is the Worldwide Universities Network Global Africa Group. This was established in 2015, and it has a particular Australia-Africa focus, or at least connection, because the executive director of the network was Australian, and then the inaugural co-chairs of the network were from Australia and South Africa. And in this network, we developed a quite innovative model, which was to focus the research activities on the 3 African members of the wider network. I think it was a 24-member network, of which 3 were African. And so we developed a regional research hubs model where we centered the research priorities and activities on University of Ghana as the West Africa hub, University of Nairobi as the East Africa hub, and University of Cape Town as the Southern Africa hub. This helped to center African research priorities in a wider network that was largely directed by its majority Euro and American members. Through this network, we developed a major collaborative research project that resulted in a book called Africa and the Sustainable Development Goals, which again took this deliberate co-authored structure where we had both African chapter leads and chapter leads from other countries in the network. The subsequent co-chair team also developed the African Charter on Transformative Research Collaboration. So this is quite a widely acclaimed set of principles for how the global North and Africa can collaborate on research. So this was originally developed out of that same Global Africa group in the network. So we can see the value of this kind of science diplomacy in creating principled collaborative research outputs. And just briefly, a couple of other initiatives that we've developed both bilaterally and collectively. We've launched the Africa Green Hydrogen Hub at Strathmore University in Nairobi as a partnership between a couple of Australian universities, Strathmore University, the Kenyan government, and industry partners. And this will be a research and education hub for new technologies around the energy transition in East Africa. We've also got a campus in Mauritius, so Curtin University, Mauritius, which is currently the only Australian university campus anywhere in Africa. And as I said earlier, this serves as a kind of embassy in thinking about it in relation to academic diplomacy. It's a 21-year partnership with a Mauritian education provider. It offers both transnational education, but also research collaboration. So we have a Centre for Ocean, Earth Science and Technology there. This features Australian degrees from our home campus taught by Mauritian academics in Mauritius to students from Mauritius, but also coming from other African countries as international students, around 2,000 students on the campus. And this is also promoting inter-campus mobility between different campuses in our network. And just finally, I just wanted to highlight back here in Australia, we have those 2 Africa-focused centres within Australian universities. So one is the one that I'm director of at Curtin University, which is the Centre for Australia-Africa Relations. This was launched in 2023 by our Vice-Chancellor. And it's really a platform to think through the connections both on the African continent itself, but also here in Australia to the diaspora, to diaspora academics, diaspora students, diaspora communities, but also Australian government and policymakers and so on. We have a number of initiatives, one including a major national research project looking at the political and economic agency of the African diaspora in Australia. And we also convene a range of other initiatives like study tours. For example, we took a group of Australian Indigenous students and staff to Mauritius and South Africa for a study tour and cultural exchange. The only other African centre in Australia is the Centre for African Engagement at RMIT University in Melbourne. And this was only launched a few months ago. But it's a similar platform in seeking to use academic diplomacy to connect stakeholders in Africa with those here in Australia, particularly in the diaspora, which is a really important and very rapidly growing dimension of the relationship. So to conclude, I want to leave you with a few things to think about in terms of pursuing science diplomacy in your own work and within your own institutions and networks. So first, I would say to be conscious about the links between science and diplomacy in your own work and consider how you might position and leverage your work within these wider contexts to increase the impact of what you're doing. As part of this, I would suggest to critically consider the political interests involved in the different formulations of science diplomacy. Really think through what is at stake here, who benefits and who loses, and what strategies can be effective given the political implications involved. Secondly, I would ask, how can African leadership of science diplomacy be advanced? And here we need to consider the roles and agency of both African governments, African institutions, universities, as well as individual scholars and scientists, and including African diaspora scientists, which I think is an understudied but potentially highly valuable set of contributors to this science diplomacy initiative. And perhaps consider joining or even establishing science diplomacy platforms in your own areas of work as a way to build these collaborative forms of international impact. Now, African Science Frontiers Initiatives is a fantastic example of this already happening, and you're, of course, already involved through this conference and beyond. But what other platforms are there out there? One of them that we work with is the South African government's Science Diplomacy Capital for Africa initiative. That's maybe one to have a look at. And finally, in this era of global disruption caused by geopolitical conflict, attacks on science, rising inequality, climate change, and rapid technological advancement, how can we collectively best practice science diplomacy to advance the interests of science and society across the world? And you only have to look at the Royal Society's latest science diplomacy report, which is 15 years after their original one, which I started the presentation with. They're now asking questions about, quote, science diplomacy in an era of disruption. And this is going to, I think, present very, very important opportunities and, in fact, necessities for us to collectively pursue science diplomacy in the face of these major global challenges that we face. So I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Prof. David. I don't know what the others feel, but for me, this has just been, I would say we've been walking through a live map, of connecting ideas, possibilities, thinking about Australia on one side and Africa on the other side, and seeing how Prof. David is actually pulling all these vibrant threads through the middle of the world, yeah? I don't know what each of you felt. You can express your reactions. You can post your comments on the chat. But most importantly, we want to appreciate the fact that Prof. David has actually spoken to a lot of bold leadership, engagement, community voices, connecting with Africa and being very purposeful, not just storylines or taglines, but thinking about how can we collaborate globally? How can we build bigger? How can we empower loudly? And most importantly, how do we stay connected? Thank you so much, Prof, for this fire, for the clarity and for the vision that you have brought. I want to take this back to Jerry to provide guidance on whether we should proceed with a few questions, or maybe, Jerry, if you're here. Jerry, can you hear me? Yes, Jerry, go ahead.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Vera, for that awesome. I think we're just going to proceed. It's a keynote, so I'm not sure we're going to do any Q&A. So we just invite Dr. Bright for he just speak both of thanks on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Prof. Bright, over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Prof. David. You can see the reaction, and I think this is reassuring for Africa, because there is a leeway we have, and we can hear from your voice saying that you have a brother, even though we are not from the same continent. But I think your career has really given you opportunity to have some understanding that support your motivation for what you're doing. So this is really great platform. It's not the first time I'm hearing some of this, but there are other aspects I heard today. And that really makes me to be happy that we made a very good choice to invite you to this conference. Your presentation aligns so much with our theme. I know how busy you are. It's not easy to get you. I was really humbled when you, without hesitation, said yes. So thank you for that. We appreciate this opportunity. Some of the things you have said here are not things a platform like SFI is used to, because it's a high stake strategies. But I know that this is an open door we have made, because as you can see, there are many young researchers within the SFI platform. that can be, from what I said during my opening speech, African science needs to become more visible, not just in the research aspect, but in the aspect you have mentioned now in diplomacy. Somebody was commenting there, said, well, perhaps African scientists have run away from where the game is happening, and the politicians have taken the stage. Perhaps that is contributing to our situation. So the point I'm making here is that we have an opportunity of a cohort of people who are hungry, who can be mobilized to develop these perspectives, these skills. And I think if we get it right, the future is really will be bright. So thank you for offering your time. I really appreciate this. And one thing in ASFI is that we don't get people once and we leave them. We hold on to them. So I know you are busy, but please be open that opportunities may come where we'll ask you, please, we need you to talk to us. The way you frequent Africa nowadays, I think maybe you stay more in Africa than even in Australia. So, so you are part of us now. Yes. So thank you very much, David. I appreciate this. And many have been asking, how can we get in touch? I tell you, Prof. David is one of the most visible people I know on LinkedIn. Right. So if you want to get in touch, just follow him. He's releasing information. He's just dishing it out, whatever is happening around his corner, or the encounters he has, exciting ones. He's releasing them. Some of the scholarships he mentioned, he's always posting them. I hope you can just go on LinkedIn, type his name, and then follow him. Those information will be coming up. And as I mentioned, if anything comes from our end that we can invite him up, we will do that. So thanks very much, David. We appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bright and Vera, and to everyone for listening and engaging. And I'd be very, very happy to follow up. And I think, Bright, we've been having a discussion about how we can connect ASFI to the Australia-Africa University Network. So that's something we certainly want to pursue. And I'll leave my contact email and LinkedIn tag in the chat so that people can get in touch with me afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, Jerry, over to you, please. Jerry, are you there?